Hello, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. By now, you should have finished reading Act 1 of Romeo and Juliet. So, what I want to do with this video is I just want to take a moment to kind of summarize and go over the important parts of Act 1. Since, again, a lot happens. So, I'm going to try and be as brief and concise as possible. But, again, it's an act. There's a lot that happens and a lot of important stuff that happens. So bear that in mind. So first part with the act, with the prologue. The prologue is kind of interesting because not only does it kind of establish the setting and the scene for the play, it lets us know that this play takes place in the town of Verona and that there is a feud between two noble houses that has been going on for a while, and that is has broken out into violence between each house. But it also gives a very, very, very general summary of the overall story. It mentions from forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove. So it lets us know right up front that this play is about the children of these two houses that are feuding, who will fall in love, kill themselves, and that with the deaths of their children, their parents will stop the feud. So that's kind of interesting, actually, that Shakespeare gives us that much of an overview right off the bat, that we know that, okay, it's about the kids, they're going to fall in love, they're going to die, and because of their deaths, that's going to stop the feud. That's kind of interesting, but again, it's a general enough summary that I would argue it doesn't necessarily compromise the story, really. It actually kind of might even make you a bit more interested, just because it gives you just enough to let you know what's going to happen, but it doesn't tell you how it happens. So anyway, looking at Act 1, Scene 1, this is a long scene, and it starts with two Capulet servants, Samson and Gregory, walking down the street in Verona, talking about how much they hate the Montagues. And in the midst of this conversation, they stumble upon two Montague servants, one of them being Abram. And in that situation, Gregory and Samson, the Capulet servants, decide to provoke the Montagues, or at least try to provoke the Montagues into starting a fight. We learned the two major families in Romeo and Juliet. You have the Montagues, Romeo's family, and the Capulets, Juliet's family. So the Capulet servants, Gregory and Samson, notably, Samson bites his thumb at Abram, a Montague servant, which was a very insulting gesture and was meant to provoke him to try and get the Montagues to start a fight. So that way, the Capulets would have an excuse to fight the Montagues and would not get in trouble for starting the fight. And the Capulet provoking and taunting works. A fight does break out between Capulet and Montague servants. And into this situation, a Montague, Benvolio, enters, who is Lord Montague's nephew and Romeo's cousin. And Benvolio immediately tries to break up the fight, demonstrating his character traits of kind of being a bit more cautious, a bit more level-headed, a guy who generally thinks things out a bit more and doesn't like violence and conflict. And so Benvolio is trying to break up the fight when into this situation, you have Tybalt, who is a Capulet, enter. Tybalt is Lord Capulet's nephew and Juliet's cousin. Tybalt, unlike Benvolio, tries to ramp up the fight and make the fight more intense. Specifically, Tybalt tries to start a fight with Benvolio. So we also see Tybalt's major character trait of being kind of a hothead who's a lot more reckless and does not necessarily think things out as well. And this fight becomes an all-out brawl in the middle of the street. You have citizens of Verona who get involved trying to break up the fight. Lord Capulet and Lady Capulet arrive, as well as Lord Montague and Lady Montague arrive. And while the lords want to go and fight each other, their wives don't let them. Eventually, it takes the arrival of Prince Aeschylus, who is the ruler of Verona, to actually break up the fight. And the prince gives us some more background on the situation. The prince tells the reader and the audience that this is the third street fight that has broken out recently between the Capulets and the Montagues. And the prince and the citizens of Verona are getting really tired of having to constantly deal with the fighting going on between the Montagues and the Capulets, and having to break up the fights and deal with them just disturbing the peace. So the prince, in response to this fight, issues a new rule with the intention to stop any further fighting. The prince declares that the next people to disturb the peace, so the next people to start fighting, will be executed. So the prince really wants to start cracking down on the violence going on between the Capulets and the Montagues, and you really get a sense of how tired the citizens of Verona are with their feud and with their behavior. After the prince leaves, we get some conversations amongst the Montagues about Romeo. And we learn that Romeo is upset and that none of his family members know why, but he's very upset and depressed. He's been shutting himself up in his room and avoiding people and going out and walking by himself all night. And when Romeo happens upon the scene, Benvolio, his cousin, decides to take it upon himself to try and figure out what's wrong with him and try and figure out what's going on. So the latter parts of Act 1, Scene 1 feature Benvolio talking to Romeo about why he's been so upset recently. And we learn that Romeo is depressed because he is in love with somebody who does not love him back. And this is really Romeo has a number of speeches and longer monologues towards the end of this act, where we start to see the development of the play's major theme about how love is dual-natured, or that love can be both a positive, uplifting, and constructive force that brings joy, and it can also be kind of a negative, misery-inducing, destructive force that brings pain to people. And Romeo, in these speeches, he illustrates this by discussing kind of how he's in pain because of something so good, or something that should be so good is causing him so much pain, and with a lot of oxymorons or contradictory statements. So, for example, towards the bottom of page 9 of Act 1, Scene 1, Romeo is talking about, oh, brawling love, loving hate, anything of nothing first created, heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep. Again, commenting how love is both. It's how love can be contradictory, a thing of great joy, and at the same time be a thing of great pain. In Romeo's case, it's a thing of pain because he is in love with somebody who does not love him back. And Sorry, scrolling through some more. If you guys thought or kind of got the impression that Romeo is a bit of a drama queen, it's because Romeo is a bit of a drama queen. A lot of Romeo, especially in Act 1 scene when Romeo is just whining a lot. I will say there's an interesting bit of exchange between Romeo and Benvolio regarding the woman who Romeo is in love with, which we learn her name later in this act, a woman named Rosalind. And Romeo, one of the reasons he's upset with her is that she has chosen to never fall in love and never take a husband because she's taken a vow of chastity and is determined to remain a virgin forever. And Romeo makes an interesting remark here that I think does kind of have just kind of an interesting impact, or not necessarily an impact, but an interesting interpretation. He mentions, for beauty starved with her severity cuts beauty off from all posterity, effectively saying that this is a shame that Rosalind, who is so incredibly beautiful, has chosen to never take a husband and remain a virgin forever, because he says that means she'll never have children, meaning that she'll never be able to pass down her beauty. And when she dies, her beauty will die with her, which is an interesting sentiment and remark. It could potentially comment on the era's emphasis on children and having children as legacy. But anyway, Benvolio advises Romeo, after listening to him whine about Rosalind, that he needs to get over her, and that the best way to get over her is to move on to somebody else. And Romeo is skeptical that he'll ever find somebody else, but Benvolio is promising him that he will find somebody else that he will like and to help him get over Rosalind. And that's the end of Act 1, Scene 1. Moving on to Scene 2. Scene 2 begins with a discussion between Lord Capulet and Paris. Paris is a count who is a relative of Prince Aeschylus, who has come to talk to Lord Capulet because he wants to marry Juliet, his daughter. And Capulet is, at first, pretty skeptical about Juliet getting married, saying that she's too young. Juliet is 13. She's just about to turn 14. And Capulet is saying that he thinks that she's too young to get married. However, he does soften his stance later on in the page when he tells Paris, woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart. My will to her consent is but a part, and she agreed within her scope of choice. Lies my consent in fair according voice. So he tells Paris in that he will allow Paris to start courting and wooing Juliet. And if Juliet wants to marry Paris, then Capulet will give them his consent and his permission to get married. And he tells Paris that he recommends that he start getting to know Juliet by coming to a feast or a party that he is throwing that night. And he invites Paris to attend the party to meet Juliet. At the time of Act 1, Scene 2, Paris and Juliet have not met yet. However, on page 2, Capulet reveals kind of an ulterior motive about why he might want Paris to come to the party. He says, fresh fennel buds shall you this night inherit at my house. Hear all see, and like her most, whose merit most shall be, which on more view of many, mine being one, may stand in number, though in reckoning none. So Capulet is effectively telling Paris that there will be other pretty girls at his house at the party that night as well, and Paris might find another one that he will like more than Juliet. So Capulet, it seems like he's trying to tell Paris no without having to outright say no. Most likely because of Paris's higher social rank and because of his relationship with the prince. He doesn't want to potentially anger the prince by denying a relative of his permission to marry his daughter. But then Capulet gives his servant Peter the guest list and tells him to go invite the people whose names are on the list. And Peter has a problem with this because as a servant, Peter can't read. But fortunately for Peter, he runs into Benvolio and Romeo, who can read, and he gets Romeo to read the list for him so he knows who to go invite. And in this exchange, Peter tells Romeo and Benvolio that Capulet is throwing a party that night and lets them know that if they're not Montagues, they should stop by. Benvolio thinks this is a great opportunity because as at this party there will be a number of pretty girls, and if the two of them basically crash this party, Romeo can find somebody new. And Benvolio also mentions that Rosalind, the girl that Romeo likes, will be at the party. So because of that, Romeo will be able to compare Rosalind with these other girls and realize that she's not that special. And hopefully, at least in Benvolio's mind, it'll be easier for Romeo to move on. But Romeo is, of course, skeptical. Moving on to Act 1, Scene 3. A short scene between Juliet, Lady Capulet, and the nurse. The nurse is Juliet's personal servant and who is effectively her nanny. This is a woman who started off as her wet nurse, but has basically just became her nanny. And she's basically the woman who has effectively raised Juliet. So Lady Capulet calls a meeting with Juliet and allows the nurse to sit in on the meeting, which is actually pretty significant because, again, Lady Capulet is allowing this servant to sit in on an intimate family discussion, which goes to show that the nurse is a trusted and important figure within the Capulet household, at least when it comes to matters pertaining to Juliet. And the nurse rambles on and on and on about her history with Juliet, mentioning that, that she's been Juliet's wet nurse and her nanny for a while, and just talks about her past with Juliet. And in the sense of her rambling and her, frankly, sharing too much information here and being a bit too informal with Lady Capulet and Juliet, the nurse reveals that she's a comic relief character, a character whose role in the story is basically that of someone who is meant to kind of ease the tension and kind of inject some humor every now and then. But talking around the nurse is rambling. Lady Capulet informs Juliet about Paris's interest in marrying her. And Juliet responds that she is interested in getting married, but just not yet. She just doesn't feel that she's ready. But what's interesting in this scene is that Lady Capulet and the nurse as well are both seem to be pretty supportive of Juliet marrying Paris. Paris has a reputation for being a good guy and a good-looking guy, but also he's a count, so he is of a higher social status and social rank than the Capulets. So by marrying him, Juliet would go up in the social hierarchy of the period. So basically, Lady Capulet seems in this scene to really be encouraging Juliet to at least give serious consideration to Paris's offer, because he's a count, so by marrying him, Juliet will gain status. He's rich, so Juliet will be provided for the rest of her life by her husband. But also, he's a good guy, and he's a good-looking guy. So Paris has a lot of good attributes that at least Lady Capulet likes and is strongly encouraging her daughter to at least give this guy a chance. And she tells Juliet that he will be at the feast that night to meet her. And Juliet is kind of lukewarm to the prospect of meeting him. She's fine with meeting him and getting to know him, but she's still not sold on marrying him and is not committing herself to anything beyond just meeting him. In Act 1, Scene 4, you see Romeo, Mercutio, and Benvolio making their way to the feast at Capulet's. This is our introduction to the character of Mercutio. Mercutio is a good friend of Romeo, but he is not a Montague. He is another relative of Prince Aeschylus. So Mercutio was actually invited to the party by Capulet. So he is not crashing, but he is helping sneak in Romeo and Benvolio, the two Montagues. In this scene, Romeo talks about how he doesn't really feel like Romeo talks about how he's not really in the mood to go to a party and have fun. Specifically, we get the metaphor of Romeo not wanting to dance at the party and Mercutio arguing that he's going to need to dance. At the top of page 2 on Act 1, Scene 4, though, we get a back and forth between Romeo and Mercutio that also serves to develop the theme of the dual nature of love, where you have Mercutio basically telling Romeo that he is putting too much pressure on love, and that because of that, he's allowing this thing that should be light and fun and just joyous and happy to cause him pain. Basically, he's being weighed down by it because he's put so much pressure on it, and it's causing him pain and making him depressed. And Romeo is countering and arguing that love is a rough thing and love is painful, and that it's not the light, joyous thing that Mercutio seems to think it is. So again, we have this back and forth illustrating the dual nature of love as, again, both this positive, uplifting force and this negative, destructive force. So we get this development of that theme and this back and forth between Romeo and Mercutio. We also learn that this party they're going to is a masked ball, as Mercutio makes a point of commenting on putting his mask on, and we see all three of them put their masks on in the middle of the scene. We also get, at the top of page 3, an interesting line by Romeo when he mentions that he says, "We mean well in going to this mask, but 'tis no wit to go," where Romeo basically says that he's got a bad feeling in his gut about going to this party because of a dream that he had. He mentions he dreamt a dream tonight. And Mercutio tries to convince Romeo not to really take this dream too seriously. We see in this scene that Mercutio is a pretty easygoing guy. He does not take he doesn't really take anything seriously, and is kind of just out to have a good time. And he is trying to discourage Romeo from taking this dream too seriously. Notably, he has a very long monologue about the mythological figure of Queen Mab, where he is trying to illustrate to Romeo why one shouldn't put so much emphasis on their dreams. He talks about how Queen Mab is this legendary figure who, again, according to legend, is a fairy who visits people while they're sleeping and causes them to dream dreams of love. But the examples of Mercutio cites are rather interesting examples of love because they're not what you'd think of. They're kind of, I'd argue, darker and more toxic examples of love. So he mentions that Queen Mab can fly o'er lawyers' fingers who straight dream on fees, and basically how she can make people dream of getting rich, which kind of contributes to the spread of greed, which is likened to being the love of money and material gain. Mercutio also cites that sometimes comes she with a tithe pig's tail, tickling a parson's nose as he lies asleep. Then he dreams of another benefice. So a parson is a priest, and a tithe pig would be a very sizable and generous gift from his congregation, paid out of their donations to the church, to put a really nice meal, to give the priest a really nice meal. And Mercutio is mentioning here how Queen Mab could make this guy, who could encourage this parson to dream of getting an additional gift from his parishioners, even though it's a lot of money from these people, and it's asking a lot of them to give him this gift. And yet he, because of his love for himself that she could inspire, he would care more about getting another donation than about the well-being of his parishioners. Mercutio also says, sometimes she driveth o'er a soldier's neck, and then dreams he of cutting foreign throats, of breeches, ambuscados, Spanish blades, of healths 5 fathom deep, and then anon drums in his ear. So basically how she can make people dream of a desire for glory or fame or recognition. So the examples Mercutio cites are more toxic examples of love, because it's almost like love directed towards, instead of being towards another person, it's love directed towards oneself and prioritizing oneself over other people, and love of money and material goods, and a love of fame and recognition, which again is rather interesting. And Romeo cuts this off, mentioning to Mercutio, "Thou talkest of nothing." And yet Mercutio counters, saying, "True, I talk of dreams, which are the children of an idle brain, begot of nothing but vain fantasy." So Mercutio basically tells Romeo, "You're right, I am talking of nothing, because I'm talking of dreams. You should not take my dreams seriously, just like you shouldn't take your dreams seriously." So again, Mercutio is trying to get Romeo to not be so stressed out and relax over his dream, or the omen he got through his dream, which on the last page of scene 4, page 5, we learn a bit more about what Romeo fears will happen. He says, "My mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars shall bitterly begin his fearful date with this night's revels, and expire the term of a despised life closed in my breast by some vile forfeit of untimely death." So Romeo is worried that by going to this party tonight, it will set in motion a chain of events that is just fated or destined to happen, that will ultimately result in his death. But he concludes the scene by saying, "He that hath the steerage of my course direct my sail." Romeo seems to believe that if this is fate, then nothing he can do can change it. So all he can do is just kind of go with the flow and just see what happens. If it's fated to be, it's out of his hands anyway. Into the last scene of Act 1, Scene 5. So the scene begins with Peter and some other Capulet servants complaining about all the work they have to do as they're cleaning up after the dinner portion of the feast. And they're complaining about other servants not sharing in the work, and about how they're being stretched really thin by their masters. But really, the bulk of the scene kicks off as Lord Capulet begins the dance portion of the evening and gets people starting to dance. And in this scene, we see Romeo fall in love with Juliet at first sight. Before he even talks to her, he looks at her and immediately falls in love with her. So Benvolio is actually kind of right that he just needed to find somebody else to move on to, and he did, Juliet. However, as Romeo was asking a servant about Juliet, basically asking him, "Who is that girl over there?" Tybalt, who is also at the feast, overhears him and recognizes him by his voice, and is enraged at the notion when he learns that there are Montagues crashing this party. He believes that the Montagues are there. trying to mock and dishonor and disrespect the Capulets. So Tybalt asks for a sword to go and fight Romeo. He's only stopped from doing so by his uncle, Lord Capulet, who actually does not seem to bear the same hatred towards Romeo as he does for Lord Montague. Capulet mentions to Tybalt that he bears him like a portly gentleman, and to say truth, Verona brags of him to be a virtuous and well-governed youth. Let him alone. So Capulet tells Tybalt that Romeo, even though he's a Montague and is not supposed to be there, he's not causing any problems. He's behaving himself. He's acting like a gentleman. He's not causing a disturbance, not bothering anybody. He's got a reputation around town for being a pretty good guy. So just leave him alone. Let him stay. He tells Tybalt, take no note of him. Show a fair presence and put off these frowns. Just telling Tybalt, let it go. Just have a good time. But we see Tybalt's hot-headed nature come out on page 4 when he starts arguing with his uncle that no, his uncle should let him go and do something about it, and that this is a disrespect. And Capulet wisely keeps shooting Tybalt down, telling him, no, you'll make a mutiny among my guests. You will set cock a hoop. You'll be the man. Basically telling Tybalt that if Tybalt were to attack Romeo or try and start something with Romeo in the middle of this feast when Romeo wasn't bothering anybody, the Capulets, and Tybalt particularly, would come out of it looking bad. Because, again, it would be interpreted as an overreaction for what Romeo was doing. And that it would bring dishonor upon their house if Tybalt were to do this. Capulet does tell Tybalt in a foreshadowing line when he says, this trick may chance to scathe you. So basically telling Tybalt that if Tybalt doesn't let this go and does try to get revenge for this, it's going to come back around and bite him in the butt. Capulet just seems to know that, look, this is not going to go well for you if you try to do something about this. Just let it go. It's not a problem. And when Tybalt keeps fighting with his uncle, Capulet just winds up kicking Tybalt out of the party. And as Tybalt is leaving, he makes another foreshadowing line. He says, I will withdraw, but this intrusion shall, now seeming sweet, convert to bitterest gall. So Tybalt is basically saying that he will leave the party because it's his uncle's wish, but he is not going to just let it go. And he does plan to get revenge on Romeo and the Montagues for trespassing and crashing the party. Next page, on page 5, we get the first exchange of words between Romeo and Juliet. And interesting enough about this first exchange of lines, the first 14 lines Romeo and Juliet speak together actually form a sonnet, which is a poem. Shakespeare, in addition to being a playwright, was also a poet and wrote, I think, about 154 sonnets or poems over the course of his life. So Romeo and Juliet's first 14 lines together actually, again, form a love poem taken together. So in this conversation, Romeo is basically flattering Juliet, telling her, so he says, I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips to blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. So Romeo is basically kind of telling Juliet that she is so beautiful that her hand is basically a holy shrine, and that he's basically making a joke like, I'm not even worthy to touch your hand with mine because you're so beautiful. But when he says, my lips to blushing pilgrims ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss, is like, but I'll make it better with kiss. So their first lines are very flirtatious. Juliet does play rather coy with him, saying, "Good pilgrim, you do your hand wrong too much. Which mannerly devotion shows in this? For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss." Basically mentioning that, no, you're reading too much into this, and that by touching her hand, she's kind of playing off his religious metaphor. By touching her hand, it's an act of devotion, and therefore it's not a sin or anything wrong. And that because of the metaphorical connotations of it, it's basically like a metaphorical kiss. And they keep, again, Romeo keeps flirting with her through this religious metaphor, saying, have not saints lips and holy palmers too? Basically saying, well, you know, saints and pilgrims and have lips too. Juliet, again, playing coy, I pilgrim lips that they must use in prayer. And Romeo laying it on thick, saying, oh, then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. So kind of playing off of her earlier metaphor that, well, palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Romeo saying, then let lips do what hands do. And they pray. So basically, it's a long metaphorical back and forth where Romeo is basically trying to get her to kiss him, and she's playing coy about it. They eventually do wind up kissing before Juliet is called away by the nurse. And Romeo asks the nurse, who is this girl? And the nurse tells Romeo that she's a Capulet, and not only a Capulet, she is the daughter of Lord Capulet. And Romeo is a bit of a crisis of conscience, where he says, is she a Capulet? Oh, dear account, my life is in my foe's debt. Where he's really kind of freaking out that he's in love with the daughter of his enemy. And on that note, that's how the party ends, and how he and Benvolio are sent home by Capulet. And then Juliet asks the nurse, who's that guy that she was talking to? And the nurse lets her know that he's Romeo and that he's a Montague. And Juliet has actually a really famous line here. She says, my only love sprung from my only hate, too early seen unknown and known too late. Prodigious birth of love it is to me that I must love a loathed enemy. Where basically Juliet is like, what cruelty is this, that I've fallen in love with somebody who is, again, my enemy by birth. Like that's like the one person I absolutely couldn't fall in love with is the person I fell in love with, is what she's saying there. And that's the end of the act. So Act 1 ends with our two lovers meeting, learning who they are, and kind of finding a bitter irony in that just as they found love, they kind of are slapped in the face by learning that the person they love is pretty much the one person they were absolutely not supposed to fall in love with. So as I said, there's a lot that happens in this act. It's a Shakespearean drama. It's 5 acts long. There's a lot that happens in the play. I hope you find this summary helpful. If you have any other questions that I didn't cover here, let me know and I will address them. There will be a quiz over Act 1 either later on this week or towards the beginning of next week. So you'll have some review assignments or review activities to go along with that and help you prepare for the quiz. So with that, take care, guys, and I'll talk to you later.